We begin this morning with the massive No Kings protest that swept across all 50 states and Washington, D.C. Organizers say at least 8 million people attended more than 3,300 demonstrations Saturday to protest against what they call President Trump's authoritarian power grabs. Some of the biggest crowds were seen at the flagship event in St. Paul, Minnesota, as well as in New York City and Los Angeles. Crowds also turned out in smaller cities and towns, including rural Republican communities. Now, the question is, what comes next for this movement? That is the question. This moment of collective catharsis be translated to a sustainable, actionable political movement going into November. And I also am very curious to see what Democrats take away from the success of the No Kings planning and messaging is going to ultimately be.
I mean, you have to imagine that, one, they're planning another one before the midterms, right? This would be the third one. It would make a lot of sense to have one sometime in the summer, maybe the fall, right before, to get people more galvanized. Right. I was one of those people after the first No Kings protest that was like, and what you're going to do with it? You know what I mean? What are you going to do with this momentum? How do you keep this momentum going? It's too early. But their ability to build over and over and over, and more importantly, from the grassroots, meaning that it's actual humans that are getting upset. It's not organizers who are professional, live in D.C. and New York. I think that tells us that there's a lot more staying power. And if Democrats aren't, and Democrats do seem to be listening, right? Yeah. They start to get tougher. They're fighting a little bit more. They're more aggressive in their messaging because that's what the people that are on the ground at these protests are telling them.
And what you're seeing is the crowd is more diverse, right? Because it started out being more female, more affluent, more white. Now it's more diverse, more mixed gender, bigger groups. I mean, if you want a protest movement, this is what it's supposed to look like. This sort of progression, more people, different kinds of people. Right. So I do think that is worth looking at. I think the danger for Democrats is that some of leadership doesn't understand that anger is also targeted at them.
Right, because it's not just like we're upset with Republicans. They're mad at everybody in that building. And if you're not finding ways to get them mad at Republicans while quelling their anger at you, you're kind of screwed. Yeah. Very good point, Molly.
Although this is such a good point that I thought one of our correspondents who's going to be on the show and host of the Weeknight made yesterday, which is that despite all of the anger, it is being done in a very joyful, humorous way. And that has sort of characterized all of these events, that despite the adversity and a lot of the things that have personally affected a lot of the people who are protesting from the Trump administration, that they're able to fight back and voice their protests in a way that
and nonviolent.
Is joyful and nonviolent.
Yeah. Nonviolent. And also, more importantly, my dad did, in fact, he sang in Palm Springs at the protest. And they were, he protested the Vietnam War. Yeah. He's here now. Another war, another protest.
Yeah. And for the people like your dad who's like protested since every war that we've had since the 60s, that's when they come out, I'm like, oh, this is serious.
Yeah. The crowds gave us a glimpse into what voters could be thinking ahead of the midterms.
There's no money for SNAP. SNAP is running out. There's no money. There's no more pantries. There's no more food resources. But we can fund a war.
The thing that pisses me off the most every day is the people that I elected are not taking a stand. They're not being outraged with us. They're not holding the line. They're not doing their job to save democracy.
The reason that you see so many people out on the streets today is because when we are bombing Iran, when Israel is bombing Lebanon, they understand that comes from the same place as ICE arresting and killing people in the streets.
I've been a MAGA supporter from the very beginning. I believed in him. I thought that he would end wars, like he said in his campaign. He said he wouldn't start wars. He said he'd bring peace to the Middle East. Now look at us. We're further from peace and closer to catastrophe than ever before. I feel so betrayed.
Joining us now after our brute crisis, former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh, who is now a Democrat, and Angelo Carusone, Chairman and President of Media Matters. I want to start where Molly left us off, which is that what you're hearing voiced in these protests and from the people that we were just listening to is not just extreme anger and frustration with the Trump administration, but also with the job that Republican and Democratic lawmakers are doing on Capitol Hill and the way that they've abdicated their responsibility. Joe, when you were out there on the street yesterday, what were you hearing from people that you were protesting with?
There's a huge sense of urgency, not just with Trump, with Republicans and Democrats. We talk all the time about how there's the very thing our founders feared is in the White House. Folks yesterday believe this, and I've been to every single one of these No Kings rallies, spoken at all of them. The sense of urgency, this guy's in our face, this is a real threat, that's growing with every No Kings protest. But I got to tell you, there's just also an overwhelming sense of joy. Like folks feel like we have the opportunity to effing do something about this. I was overwhelmed by that yesterday.
But the question that, to Jackie's point, is when you have a president who isn't doing things that most of the country likes, and you have a Congress that hasn't been effective in maybe since you were in office, like for a very long time. You have Republicans who are in his pocket, and you have voters who want to see Democrats doing more, even if there's not many more tools in their tool belt when they're in the minority. It tells me that as we move forward, it's going to be it's going to be tougher for Democrats than I think they think, right? Getting the gavel is one thing. How you do the investigations, who you're investigating, the speed at which there's progress is going to matter. Angelo, you pay a lot of attention, I think maybe more than anyone at this table, to the right-wing media ecosystem. What did they think of yesterday's protest? Did they pay attention? And what does their reaction tell you about what's moving forward?
Two things, especially you can compare it to how they reacted last time.
Yeah.
And they did talk about it this time. And now they talked about it a lot less. And that's, I think, because they didn't have a strong message yet. Now, eventually they'll find something and they'll throw it out there. But the one thing that they have so far pushed is that it's all fake. These are all paid protesters.
Very expensive.
This would be very expensive. That there is some shadowy force that is paying it. The same shadowy force that they would argue is importing all of these immigrants so that they can perpetually steal the election. That seems to be their anchor, is that there is this force behind it. It is funding all of it. And nothing that you see is authentic. And I think that gets to what he was saying, which is that there is, when you're looking at it, there's sort of a generalized sense of frustration. There's nothing happening at these protests that seems super stunty or that's going to capture it away. It seems that it's emphatically not one demographic or one geographic region, and there's a joyful part of it that seems, one of the takeaways from the joyful part is that it's productive. That doesn't seem to be performative, and that cuts against they're all being paid protesters' narrative, because in theory they'd be performers. You'd see a lot more performance, and it hasn't landed really yet.
Joe, you came up through the Tea Party, right? So you really have seen firsthand what a Tea Party protest looks like versus...
What a turn you've taken.
Right. And now you're here. Not a normal trajectory, but I would love you to talk about the sort of differences you see on the ground. If you see them, compare the two movements.
Molly, I got to write a book. That's such a great question, because in many ways it's similar. We can argue about the Tea Party another day, but it was grassroots, and it was folks who were afraid of potential government tyranny and a king, and my God, now here we are, and they've abandoned all those beliefs. But Molly, this is so much bigger. Right. I've got to tell you this. This is a much bigger movement than the Tea Party. It is much more joyous and like we have the chance to do something. And I think the difference is because the Tea Party, we railed about, oh, my God, a potential king or tyrant in the White House. He's freaking here. Like, people out there know it and believe it. We have a king. We have tyranny right now. And as joyous as everybody was yesterday, there's a fear. This is here now.
Yeah. When you are surveying sort of the messaging that you feel like broke through, at least online, and on the internet and into more the mainstream media, is there anything that you feel like is instructive for Democrats to take a lesson from? I
think there's two things that seem to really get, the way I measure breakthrough is the types of engagement, kinetic energy that it gets, not just in terms of how many likes and shares, but is that something people are not just retweeting or reposting, but actually retelling? Are they actually going into other spaces and saying, I heard this thing, I saw this thing, let me tell you about it? And the two things that seem to be taking away so far, and it is a through line from the last, was one, first-time participants in civic engagement.
Yeah.
That gets a lot of traction and breaks through, because what it says is they finally decided to do something that it wasn't, even though they may be in their 60s or 50s or whatever, they've never participated before, but they finally decided to do something now. And that says a lot. It means that this is different. There's something about this that inspired them to take action. A lot of that helps organize new people. That's the first thing. And then the second is that there's the ability after the protest to go and do something, anything. And you've seen that across the board. More people running in for races that they've never run before. You've seen what's played out in some of these specials. So that there's this long tail. Those two pieces break through, especially people coming out and explaining, I've never done this before, but I'm finally going to get out there and do it.
I want to go to Philip Stone. He's a Vietnam War veteran, and he was yesterday condemning the GOP for backing Trump's authoritarian behavior. Listen to him.
I can't believe that Republican congressmen and senators who have each sworn an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States are sitting supine in front of this wannabe dictator who, with their assent, is becoming an actual dictator. I consider him to be a traitor.
A traitor?
A traitor, yes.
If you're a Republican running in Congress this year, trying your damnedest to get your job back, are you scared of hearing that? Because that is a sentiment that is not just from Philip Stone, that is throughout the country in big cities and small towns.
Plenty of them are scared, and the ones who are scared aren't running for re-election.
Yeah, we had another dropout this week.
Oh my God, the number of Republicans running for the hills right now, those are the ones who are scared. If you're not running for the hills, then sadly you got to stay on that Titanic until November.